Welcome to the Columbia University School of Professional Studies and Emeritus Professors in Columbia lecture, Why Does New York Look the Way It Does? With urban planner, educator, civic and community leader, Ethel Sheffer. I'm George Calderaro from Columbia School of Professional Studies, Auditing and Community Programs. The School of Professional Studies is delighted to resume our programming with Emeritus Professors in Columbia, aka EPIC, after a pandemic delay. We're especially pleased to offer this lecture, which has garnered over 400 reservations, a record for our public programming. I guess people are ready to start talking and listening again. In her lecture, Ethel Sheffer will be discussing examples of some of the great developments and zoning regulations in New York, from the skyscraper and central business districts to the development of low-rise neighborhood communities, to the growth of suburban living, and to the impact of the automobile, as well as recent super tolls and increased challenges of density. Following her talk, we'll take questions from you all. Please post questions at any time using the Q&A function of this webinar. Please note that we're recording this talk as well, and it will be available to view and share on this event's page on the SPS site next week. So let's begin. Ethel Sheffer has served as an adjunct professor in Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation for more than 15 years. She has an extensive knowledge of New York City's neighborhoods, has been a community leader in several noteworthy battles and developments, has served as the president of the New York chapter of the American Planning Association, and is a member of the New York City Public Design Commission. New Yorkers, and especially Upper West Siders, may recognize the name Sheffer from her and her late husband Ira Sheffer's work, Isaiah Sheffer's work to create Symphony Space, which Isaiah legendarily directed for decades. So Ethel, thank you for your years of service to New York. Now please tell us why it looks the way it does.
Hello, and this is in a way an innovation for me, because I am going to talk about several topics, but really giving a bird's eye view of the first comprehensive zoning law in New York and the development of it. But you know, to be a zoning expert is to, even at this point, to be among a fellows or fraternity or sorority of maybe 200 lawyers who spend their lives and make a lot of money dealing with zoning, which the zoning resolution in New York has now grown to maybe 1,000 pages. And how many people could understand them? What I'm going to try to do today is to do a quick historical survey of early New York, and with the point being that New York began to engage in regulation of property and so on, and then moving toward a landmark and well-known accomplishment of New York, which is that it passed the first comprehensive zoning legislation, which proliferated, and of course almost every town, every state has zoning, perhaps with the notable exception of Houston. So if we can begin, okay, so I begin with the bravado, but yet historically correct, that it is New York's beginnings is in many ways our most historic place. And this wonderful map focuses on the beginnings, Lower Manhattan, where so much of the settlement and initial development occurred. We are leaving out the obvious, and that is the permanent residents who were there before all these new people arrived. Now, it was in even earlier than the 20th century, and I still think quite remarkable, that in very early in New York's history, 1807, New York appointed the state 3 commissioners to develop a city street grid. And you can see the outlines of it, Lower Manhattan and Midtown Manhattan. And it was remarkably daring and unusual because, as you know, characterizing Manhattan, it's a right angles street grid of the avenues being laid out, the streets at right angles, and it is a characteristic pattern of Manhattan north of the original settlement by the Dutch and others, and then going up all the way, almost all the way to northern Manhattan. And indeed, the street grid, the plan to lay it out that way reinforced the notion of the city growing north. And I simply mention these very important trends and issues. Of course, the enormous amount natural in the United States of America and in the American culture and economy from the earliest days, leading to a great deal of real estate speculation. It wasn't necessarily planning as we think about it, but what did occur was the laying out continued along the lines that I described. And at another time, could spend a really quite interesting time on how the streets were laid out and how it worked. But they were laid out a certain way, and then in private terms, people acquiring property would, so to speak, open the streets according to the commissioner's plan. And the street openings was a private affair, and the property owners paid for that. So there is an early map. And then I move ahead because, of course, in the middle to late 19th century, indeed, the city grew very rapidly. And here are a couple of points in the population growth. And from 1830, you can see the estimate was 250,000, growing to 1,500,000, probably more. And indeed, the economy expanded as there was, in the middle, late 19th century, considerable industrialization. So the middle and upper class stated, I'm not giving you all the definitions, but using that term, move north, and downtown becomes primarily commercial, except for the great waves of immigration, and initially many of the downtown residents were also working class families who lived in boarding houses, cheap hotels, and then in tenements, usually constructed by private owners and often exploiting the renters who lived there. And in many cases, initially residences were demolished for stores, office, some parks, and streets. I'm talking now about Lower Manhattan. And here is an example of some of the tenements and of the layouts of the tenements. Now, what became clear in not only with the population growth, but the concerns and the obvious incidents and proliferation of fires, but even more important were health and safety concerns of the spread of smallpox, safety concerns of fires, no fire escapes, and so on. And there, at the same time, in the late 19th century, reformers and many progressives began to focus on the living conditions in the teeming places like, and very notably, the Lower East Side. And, I'm sorry about that. Okay, let me move ahead. Yeah, and so here are some examples of concern. The heading is perhaps mine or others, but what was being asked for here is, heaven help us, the term planning, and some rules rather than the complete difficulties, mess, and almost anything goes of tenements and of slums and fires and difficulties of public safety. So, but the downtown was growing with those characteristics, but also as we move closer to the beginning of the 20th century, in fact, as you see in this quite wonderful photo on Fifth Avenue, which was indeed early on the fancier avenue, that there began to be traffic congestion, shopping, density, and there was beginning to be the building of the subways, increasing traffic. And so there were other effects of this. Remember, New York had one of the most important ports that led to its, and surrounded by water, led to its prosperity. But there was really concern, which I'm simply mentioning here, of the great importance of dealing with the natural conditions and not with the congestion, creating density and destroying the proposed subways and other conditions for the foundations for sewers and so on. So, but then again, as the country was growing, indeed, in the shorthand here, indeed congestion downtown, but this was a big city, and there was Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx, which certainly there was a great deal of empty land. And however, along the way, there began to be a sense of conflicting uses downtown with the growth, and yet a great deal of land in the rest of the country. And then, as I will show you in a moment, as we get to buildings, for some, there was considered to be, and I'll tell you a bit about the movement that helped to engender the beginnings of the first zoning, and that was a sense of maybe there has to be some sort of planning, although some hated that use of the term. I go back for a moment to look at Fifth Avenue again, and it was the store owners, many of the residents, the merchants, who very much did not approve of, if you like, the chaos. That is, they did not want to see the spread of, for example, loft manufacturing buildings, the construction of them, and wanted to preserve the character of the retail area, and quite frankly, were concerned about the proliferation of immigrants and tenements and what they viewed as chaos. So the Fifth Avenue Commission began to establish itself, and among other things, began to propose building heights for new buildings in the area. Now, I do want to say, I'm doing this quickly and don't necessarily have a visual, but I want to please remind you that tall buildings and height in New York City did not begin with the equitable building, which I will tell you about, but in fact, there were many tall buildings, important ones. Among them was 140 Broadway, otherwise known as the Singer Building, of indeed the machines and so on. And it was originally built in 1897, then expanded, and that building rather early on rose to 50 floors and to 700 feet. And so, and the big thing with many of the buildings in New York that grew to considerable heights was, of course, the invention early on in the 19th century of what? Of the Otis elevator, thereby, and of course, the invention and entrepreneurial of new steel construction. The Otis elevator, I think it's hard for us to maybe envision it, which was actually invented in the 1850s. And so the Singer building, among others, benefited from that. On the other hand, the tenements had difficulty with fire escapes and so on. So I'm going to come back to the equitable in 1 second. I want to move ahead to the second. Okay, I'm going back. All right. I wanted to be able quickly to just do justice, please, quickly, to the concern of so many reformers with the unregulated tenements, with the dangers on public health and so on. And I will cite the very important book, which many of you may know, and that is by the great reformer Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. And in fact, that book, along with the movement for regulation of tenements, including a number of those of the so-called old and new tenement laws, which focused on making the living conditions and construction more humane and safer. There were several, and culminating in the Tenement House Act of 1901. So, and though there were several passed by the state as well as the city. So now let us move to the equitable building, which there was one version of it that began in 1912-13, but then there was a fire, and the one that we are now about to talk about was finished in 1915. Now, the point of this, the equitable building, is very famous and often is looked upon as it was the equitable building that outraged developers and others and absolutely was the spur for what was the first zoning law. There's no question that it was very important, but it was part of all these other concerns about height that began to impress many of the real estate people, architects, and others. So I just go back for a minute, just reviewing the earlier building code that did begin to regulate and dealt with fire safety, column internal fireproofing, and so on. But then here we are looking at the equitable building. Now, if we could have, we're not going to have a quick back and forth, but I'm sure that many of you who go downtown or live in New York recognize it, because this extraordinary building that in so many ways stirred outrage and yet was an important example of why there began to be zoning reforms. And it is still there, and you could go and visit it. And in fact, at 170 Broadway, and if I may ironically, interestingly, mention to you that in the last 10 or 15 years, I think it's 10 or 15 years, that the Department of City Planning actually has its headquarters there, and that's where you go for public hearings. And it also has been designated a New York City landmark. And so it has that protection. But now let's spend a bit of time on the equitable and the concerns, and then go to the question of the legality and why it stimulated regulation. So what do we see here? One concern for many was that the straight up building, please note that the building was, I think, about 550 feet high. For a little while in its history, it was, for about a couple of years, was even considered the tallest building in the world for a while. And please note that it goes straight up and there are no setbacks. And remember too, that the streets being laid out that at right angles across the way, the other streets also were the subject of ownership and speculation. And some of those owners said, wait a minute, this building is casting shadows on the neighboring building, on my building, thereby hurting the value of my property. So I'm going to now, before I get to the famous lawsuit which comes in 1925 in Ohio. First, now I'm going to, with you, begin to examine the beginnings, the first zoning law in the country, a comprehensive one, which was in 1916. Now, a word, because we live in a period of time in which there are movements of reformers, of people who are looking for the beautiful city. There are those who join with that because they have their own interests. And so it was that, as I mentioned, that just before the building of the equitable, by the 1910s and 12s, the progressives who already been instrumental in passing the health legislation and regulating tenements turned their eyes, of course, to the broader urban problems beyond the tenement housing. And it really began the movement, I would say, in earnest with the creation of a government authorized commission, the creation of the Heights of Buildings Commission. Great title, just wonderful. And who is it brought into existence by? This is 1913. I was just awkward in my statement, but you get it. By the Manhattan Borough President, whose name was George McEnany. By the way, it used to be, McEnany's a name that has continued. And many years ago, when I began to become a community, maybe agitator, but really advocate, a few of us together joined to lobby about the numbers of homeless people and the single room occupancy hotels and concerns about that. And one of the leaders of that was Brian McEnany in the 1970s. And he worked, I think, for White and Case. And what was so terrific about our little group then, we were like 5 people. One was this sort of prosperous lawyer with the historic name. Another was the wife of a superintendent of a tenement building a couple of blocks away. Another was me, who was teaching, but then was upset about seeing people in so much trouble on Broadway and homeless and others. So we were that kind of group at the time. But going back quickly, it was George McEnany joined by a lawyer and reformer who was named Edward Bassett, and he was chaired the HPC. So very quickly, there were a number of commissioners, and they began in their deliberations and advocacy to make a plan to carve up the land into zones, all the land available in the city, which would stipulate allowable use, height, and lot coverage. And they recommended that factories should be encouraged but separated from homes. And buildings would not necessarily have height caps, but they would have to have setbacks from the street as they got higher, and there would be courtyards and open space, especially in residential areas. Their findings were summarized in a famous report, and I'm going to show some pictures of what they did. Called Report of the Heights Building Commission, published in 1913. It was on the basis of the report that New York State amended its constitution to allow for the city to create and enforce zoning regulations. And then the city's legislative body, some of you may remember this, some of you older and who've lived in the city, the Board of Estimate and Apportionment, the city legislative body, implemented the state authorization and wrote the new law. By the way, that commission was also chaired by Edward Bassett, who continued being the force behind this. And there too, the supporters of this were the real estate and business communities, which included skyscraper owners, the Fifth Avenue merchants, and tax officials who saw that if they set up rules, it would help to protect private property. And for many, many others, they also felt that it would be possible to make a better city, to allow for the city to be varied and provide a variety of uses. In this quick category, it may be hard to see, but the height, use, and area restriction, there were three categories, basic categories: residential, business, which could include commercial and industrial, and unrestricted. Perhaps it's hard for you to see a little bit, but just here within the legislation, underneath the business districts, they included a number of uses and in a particular way. I put this in because you will see that in our modern period, the zoning resolution is filled with uses, many of which are outdated. These were already difficult: carpet cleaning, a crematory, distillation of coal wood, and so on, dry cleaning. Okay, so I move on. Here is a replica of one of the original maps. By the way, everyone, how could I have neglected this? This legislation was 14 pages with 4 maps, I think. And it's really quite extraordinary that indeed did occur. And here's one of the maps. By the way, I do believe that the New York Public Library has these original maps in one of the replicas, and the downtown, the main branch, is just a treasure trove, and they often will show these, and that is wonderful. Now, here is one example of what was authorized here, and it's a drawing that they use. For example, in commercial areas, there was no height limit, but different kinds of height districts, of which you see by setbacks until until each one reaches a so-called sky exposure plane, and that determines how high it will be. And also the big thing is by establishing setbacks and not going straight up the way the equitable building still does, sunlight meets the street. Okay. Now here is, it's maybe hard to see, but it's another one of the maps that the New York Public Library, of the original and of the diagrams. And there in the drawing, you could see that was in the 1916 zoning text, the way setbacks would work. Okay, so now I move ahead and then come back to the growth of some of these, but I will move to the major question in relation to the first comprehensive zoning legislation, which New York City remarkably has that distinction. Let me tell you, however, there were other zoning laws and legislations in other places in the United States. Los Angeles had some and others, but this continues to be considered the most comprehensive one. And here are some of the questions, which to some degree, I guess I'm also phrasing it in a more modern way, but these are some of the basic questions. There wasn't really many legal precedents for this kind of thing. Is this, and I'll come back to it, a taking by the state? For those of you who know the 5th and 14th Amendments and know that there are, that the police powers that every government have, and yet in the United States, there are considerable guarantees and in the amendments for what? For the state not to arbitrarily take private property without procedure and without the assertion of rights. So, for example, as we begin to think about this, was use districting a form of segregation? That is, and indeed, over the years, the concern over many years of dancing establishments being located in its own district and certainly not next to residential, in part was reflected the concern against Negroes who made these terrific dancing establishments, and others wanted them not to be near where they lived. By the way, this has changed, and it's about to change even more about the mixture of nightclubs and dancing, even in some residential uses. And then lastly, how to view property in an urban setting. So here then is the famous Supreme Court case, because the constitutionality of this was not in fact tested by the 1916 law, but in fact by a case that occurred years later in 1925. And I'll make sure that I'm with it. We're good. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more, because I've just given you some of the highlights, but this is worth spending a bit of time. And that is in the town of Euclid, Ohio. A business entity, a real estate entity, Amber Realty, owned about 68 acres in the village of Euclid, which is a suburb of Cleveland. And so the village, is this familiar? In an attempt to prevent industrial Cleveland from growing into the suburb and taking over Euclid, tried to prevent the growth of industry, which might change the character of the village. And so among other things, they wrote legislation. We won't go into all of it, but I will quickly say that divided the property involved into 3 use classes, as well as the legislation provided various kinds of height and area restrictions, thereby basically hindering, that's the argument, that Amber Realty from developing the land for what it wanted, namely industrial uses. The suburb, the town said, no, heaven help us, we've left the city for that. And so Amber Realty, the legislation was passed, and Amber Realty sued the village, arguing that the zoning ordinance had substantially reduced the value of the land by limiting its use, and it was a deprivation of liberty without what? Due process. So going quickly, the lower court simply dismissed the whole complaint, said that Amber had no right to sue, and it should go to the Euclid Zoning Board as required, and they didn't want to do that, of course, and all of this moved up. And then there was even the not so hidden concern and mention that that certain uses would be encouraged implicitly or explicitly, the quote, colored or certain foreign races from invading a residential section, thereby enforcing racial segregation and falling afoul of yet another legislation. Okay, so now quickly to the Supreme Court and the landmark case, not the New York zoning resolution, but the Supreme Court agreed with the lower court that had dismissed Amber, but did state that Amber had offered no evidence, or certainly not sufficient, that the ordinance had any effect on the value of the property, but instead it based its assertion only on depreciation. That's speculation. And the village saying this is a taking, and it's an unreasonable extension of the village's police power, which the village couldn't do, that did not stand the test in the Supreme Court. But remember, please, that Amber had argued their case on the basis of the 14th Amendment due process clause. And the court noted, no, the law, you'd have to show that this is discriminatory and it's not rational. And the court said no. And the famous, I simply mentioned a planner and lawyer who argued it, Alfred Bettman, who at the time was supported by, remember the middle 1920s, by the Ohio Planning Conference, which is now part of the American Planning Association, and is a chapter of it. And they all offered a friend of the court, arguing that it's okay. It's in short, that those regulations can find their justification and some aspect of police power and the public welfare. So that's the very noteworthy example of what that occurred. And at the time, lastly, on this point, when Euclid was decided, zoning was really a relatively new concept. And there had been all sorts of rumblings before that this was an unreasonable intrusion into private property, that the government is restricting how an owner might use it. These kinds of arguments are absolutely continue to this day, often when there is low zoning residential uses and when there is an attempt to upgrade, to either make the zoning higher and of course to bring in different kinds of buildings. The last thing that just should for you students of history, and you should take a look, the Amber and the property was undeveloped after this for 20 years until General Motors came in and built an aircraft plant there during World War II. And later there was a General Motors Fisher body. And finally, the city of Euclid, believe it or not, and the Euclid Landmarks Commission dedicated an Ohio historical marker there to formally recognize the landmark site. Okay, so now onward more rapidly. So I'm not digressing. This could be a whole, I wanted to be able to do almost a whole presentation on this, but I want to stop to pay good attention and lip service to the importance and the fame and of New York and its skyscrapers. Here are some examples of skyscrapers, New York's prosperity, and I have it after 1916, and you can see and identify some of them, including in the background, which came later, the Empire State Building. And I just want to, yeah, no, this, sorry. Did I do something we want? Yeah, here we go. I just want to show you quickly, these are postcards that the romance of the skyscraper became, those first skyscrapers became part of movies and New York. And these are some postcards. And I even, there on the left is the original Singer building. There we have the Equitable and the Singer Tower behind. There's the Chrysler building. The funny thing of the Empire State Building with a dirigible touching, and you remember there was later on a crash into it. And of course, this is Rockefeller Center. I show these because here on the left, which is of course still there, one of the most beautiful, revered buildings in architecture, the Woolworth building. And I'm skipping, we won't deal with this, but I've put in this particular photo. There's the Woolworth building, and there is after the ending and bombing of the original World Trade Center, here is the new one going up, which does exist, just to show you that. And I take this quickly, which there's much more to say. I liked very much, because there's much to talk about this, of Michael Kimmelman, the critic here. New York skyline became a civic signature, the postcard picture, the classic movie image of the American century. Its contours a reflection of what was happening below. That's a key as a planner. And I don't show you here, but the Empire State Building, those of you who've walked there are streets there. You walk and then you look up. What is not the case now in the famous super talls, which we're not going to be talking about now, that have gone up at Billionaires Row, it's not great in terms of the street life and the retail and so on, but of a vital, and how the towers met the sidewalk and the curb. So I'm showing this as it's integral to what occurred in New York's great growth, in particular in the 1920s. And there are those of you who know that the Empire State Building and the wonderful photo began in the Depression, in the construction, and the construction of it was finished in about 2 or 3 years. It was done so rapidly. Now, what I now move to is quickly the growth of the city, and of course the great expansion of the city continues for another 40, 50 years. But as the time goes on, it became clear to many in the next 40 or 50 years, and I should let you know this before I let you know with the 1961 zoning resolution, and that is that the country the city was becoming suburban. The growth of the automobile meant that it dominated often how people went to work, and the city grew enormously. In fact, if the 1916 resolution continued the way it was originally hoped for, at the same time, the city and its suburbs would have grown, could be projected to grow to 50 million people in the next 50 years, and that would have made it intolerable. So a number of the changes and intervening changes to accommodate suburbia and the automobile begin to occur. And then finally, a big change occurs in the 1961 zoning resolution, a very, very complicated, much bigger a change in it. And and I'll show you some examples soon, it established use groups. There's so many, and I'll show you a slide. It introduced different kinds of bulk regulations to control density and ensure, like, very technical, and new concepts to reflect new ideas. And the big thing, addressing the automobile. I'm now going to give you just examples of how difficult it is to understand this. This is an example of a district map that you consult. And what did occur with the 1961 was clearly a definition of R districts, residential, C commercial, M manufacturing. And many of it in the map, there are sub-districts with hyphens there, which means that there are particular features here. And this is an M district, which has other kinds of sub-districts. So it's extremely complicated, but it reflects the complexity of the growth of the city. Here we are. Take a look at this. Take a look at how hard this is to understand. Please, if I could reference 10 seconds of my husband, Isaiah Sheffer, who ran cabarets and did all sorts of things at Symphony Space. And in one perfectly hilarious political cabaret and at the failure, he put up this kind of map, asking me for it. And I think he did it as a satire of me and what I had done, and in a way, maybe an homage. And that is, he showed this, and I can still remember it. He begins to say, here is a simple zoning map. And the people in the cabaret sitting there laughing and drinking are on the floor with the hysteria of the idiocy, because this is so complicated that you can't even begin to understand it. I stopped for a minute on this, not to digress, but I have 3 that are 3 and 3 of buildings built and in a variety of districts, such as the one on the right is an R10A district. It's an Upper West Side building that's on Broadway, and it is an example of building built under R10A after 1961. And then in the middle to show a new building relatively on the Upper East Side. That also, and I'll come to it in a second, also took air rights and preserved the lower older building. Here's a new building in Tribeca, and I take one more quickly. Here's three more of suburban. Here's on the top left. This is Whitestone, Queens, and this too is regulated as part of R1, and to show how zoning encourages it, because it goes from R1 to 10, but really more than 10. Here is the one in the middle is example Dyker Heights. Here's a new building that went up in Williamsburg. Here is the wonderful, gorgeous, historic neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant. a big building that was protested but is legal of the Lower East Side, and another, and then the tenement and building. But I quickly illustrate to you some of these examples now. We're not going to go over it, but for example, within the modern zoning resolution, the text, now there are 18 different use groups. It takes up a lot of them, and they are, you being a developer or others have to, whatever you're building, you have to adhere to the particular use groups on the lot, and there are 18 and there are hundreds. And believe me, just as was the case at the beginning of the century, if you try to read some of them, many of them are completely outdated because there might have been a stable on the Upper East Side, but it really is no longer there. Now I quickly go this, and this is crucial. And at another time, I hope we can come back to talk about this more. There is an 1961 a tool and a concept that becomes part of zoning, and it's very important. In shorthand, it's called FAR. What it is floor area ratio. What does it mean? It reflects the building, the ratio of the built floor to the lot area. And this is the quick heading of it. I'll show a couple of examples. The FAR, the way you obtain it is if the FAR, for example, is 10 high, you multiply the FAR by the lot size. That will give you the maximum permitted floor area or square footage of a building. Here is an example, a diagram. The FAR, and these are listed and detailed. Let's say it's capped by the city. There are higher ones to a maximum of 10. So 10 means, here's our lot. An FAR of 10 means you can build 10 times the floor area of a lot in any configuration. Here's an example. It's filling the entire lot. So it doesn't need, it's like a dense building and maybe sidewalk. A 20-story building maybe can go on 50% and it's left open with open space. Here's
Excuse
another.
me, Ethel, I just want to point out.
Yes, please. Sure.
Probably got about 10 more minutes, but
Okay.
if people want to ask a question, please, again, put it in the Q&A and we will get
Great.
to it. So maybe
Absolutely.
about 5 minutes.
Sure.
Is that what
That's great. That's terrific. Here's another example, a 10,000 square foot lot, one FAR, and the different ways that a lot can be configured, and anybody has to calculate the FAR. Here's another one with, okay. Now, I mentioned this quickly, since this is important often for landmarks and others. What can occur, and often does, there is such a thing and regulate of the transfer of development rights. These allow landowners to buy unused airspace from neighboring building and locate it to this. To say this was an older building, it wasn't built to a 10 FAR. Now the zoning is 10 FAR, so the new property owner can literally borrow that and make the taller building near it. That's okay. Then different things. Contextual zoning is what's so important. When I first began to be a community advocate and was concerned about new zoning on the Upper West Side, I was concerned about promoting, and for city planning, I didn't understand contextual zoning, so that new buildings should match others and that the sidewalk should be respected. A different kind called height factor is a tower form, and there's a whole world of zoning that has to do with that. There are some, this is very important, and we could spend a good deal of time and interest more and more since the incentives. a developer could get more of height, and or if he provides a public benefit, like a privately owned public plaza, but get more floor area. This is major because housing now and affordable housing is so important. And this is an example of providing that and getting more. However, this I got to say, because I can't leave you with all this complexity. With all of this and these many different rights and specialties, actually everyone, 90%, 85% of development in New York occurs as of right. You don't have to go through all of this because when you have a lot and you're not seeking anything else, you conform to all the relevance of the provisions of the building code. And that you don't need to go for these special, because you're not asking for. So most are as of right, and it's the buildings department that has to do this. There are discretionary actions I mentioned which can occur, we won't. And lastly, since the 80s, there is a public review and a uniform land use review procedure that the community boards are involved in, and it's a public review process when, not for as of right buildings, but it is a legal process which involves the community boards, city planning, and ultimately the city council. This is some explanation. It's when I first got started, I didn't know any of this. And then wanting to work at this, I learned about ULURP. And here is steps, because this is what happens under certain rules. And this is a public process that is quite important indeed. The last thing, which we won't have time to go into, but I want to let you know, I've got this summary. Believe it or not, everybody, now, the last 2 weeks, and it's online, and I was going to say, the Adams administration is now proposing major zoning amendments 2022 with 3 different parts. Notice the name: economic opportunity, housing to increase housing, and an environmental, more solar use. There's 3 parts to it, and it's part of a new proposal. So zoning's still with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethel. That was just terrific. You got us through the entire history of New York in record time.
With a certain emphasis.
But, and it was so great that there are several questions that are, the first questions that come up is, how can I get a recording of this?
Okay.
So congratulations, Ethel. So I will say again, on the page, on the School of Professional Studies page where this event is, there will be posted a video next week. Check here this time next week and you should be fine. Another flattering question is, we have another session about Robert Moses, which brings up, the whole issue of preservation, which you weren't able, which I'm very interested in.
Of course. Also, there was a rather good movie shown of Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, a documentary about that. But yes, right. Very much so.
And we could get into the 1965 landmarks law. And
well, that's very important at what's happening now. I mean, it's just wonderful. It deserves its own, right.
And also the demolition of Penn Station, which may, in 1963,
the worst,
which may or may not have, wasn't completely responsible for the establishment of the Landmarks Commission, but it certainly contributed to the movement. And that also touches on exactly to your excellent points and observations of what's happening now with the Penn District, the Hochul-Vornado proposed Penn District to eliminate much of what's left of the area that
I
is
would-
surrounding Penn State?
I
I don't know
think-
if you can comment briefly
Sure,
on
no,
that.
no, it's very difficult. I think it would be wonderful for some of us to spend time and understand this more, because the complexity of this district now, which has not completely come to city planning, is that there is the need and a long time proposal to expand and modernize the sometimes hated current Penn Station after the travesty that was around the world with horror of the demolition of the great original one. But now there is also a state effort for development of the area around Penn Station and expanding and new zoning and new building and doing away with the existing uses and the character. And it hasn't been going through the city planning process. So it's very complicated. It's very important. And it needs to be part of public discussion and change, because it's in a very critical part of Manhattan.
Another quick question, and I think you touched on this.
Okay.
Can an as-of-right building get a variance to go higher? I think the answer was yes.
It can get a variance. The getting higher puts it into another category of the regulation, such as if it's providing a public benefit, and so then it can increase
or
it.
affordable housing.
Or affordable housing, right. There's a number of things over the years. Many buildings in Midtown have provided another subway entrance in their building.
Like One Vanderbilt.
Exactly. Well, this is one which is very tall, and that's a very significant one. But there are many of the office buildings in Midtown, which have provided another subway stop within their building, and they have received a bonus in floor area.
Right.
And those are very good too. Subway stops are very important.
This will be the last question, and
Okay.
it's not really a question, and you couldn't answer it if you tried, but I'm going to
Please.
tell you what it is, and maybe we could think about how to
Sure,
answer it together,
You bet.
perhaps with a follow-up to this,
Yeah,
touching
go
on
ahead.
Moses, etc. But with the vast knowledge and experience you have had over the years seeing New York City zoning, what books, subscriptions, readings, sources of information would you suggest to stay up to date with zoning and regulations with NYC as each section varies? It's epic.
This is epic.
Yeah.
I mean, I could send you, or we could talk about it, or maybe do more, to show you. But there are organizations. I mean, like the Municipal Arts
Yeah.
Society.
Well, what about like City Land?
City Land, yeah, and
Like,
City.
which is a publication of is it the New York Law School?
Yes, that's very good, and also a very good source is NYU's. What's the name of it? The Center.
The center.
Yeah, they have a huge. Why am I not thinking?
Yeah.
But they have so many good publications. Furman, thank you. And Furman, they have just put out their latest new book on housing and all the neighborhoods. It's the first time that when I called them, because I do it online, but for years I've said, so will you please send me a hard copy? I like it on the shelf near me. And they wrote, we're not even doing that. You could get it online, which I know how, but I was sorry. Well, yes, Furman's a great source.
The Furman Center at NYU.
Yeah,
and again, we recommend the New York Law School, City Land, and their whole city planning department. Well, we're out of time. We're over, in fact. But we welcome you to share this recording next week. And mostly, thank you, Ethel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I thank very much the School of Professional Studies, and I very much thank EPIC. And it's wonderful that both was sponsoring this, and it's a thrill for me, and I've enjoyed it, and we have to do more. Thank you.
Thank you.